Chapter 15, Big Bitch. Karen, Jack, and Bill paced with great anxiety around the large bonfire. Boris perched upon his wooden stand. Bill paused, pacing, and stared into the darkness beyond the tree line of the clearing. He whined. "It's okay, Bill. Tyler isn't going to get hurt." She tried to console Bill, but then wondered why she was pacing. If she really believed Tyler was okay, she'd be sitting on the falling tree eating something. Karen continued pacing. Jack paced and stayed as near both her and Bill as possible. He felt an urge to protect them, a familial connection, and also determination to protect his pack. It wasn't like a protective feeling you have over your family and friends when you're human, but more of a feeling of willingness to sacrifice your own well-being to protect them at any cost with no questions. Tyler was more than his friend now. He was more than family. An explosion of excitement and unexpected intrusion from the silent darkness. Instant chaos rocked Bill, Karen, and Jack and sent them all reeling around to the far end of the clearing behind the fallen tree. Boris lifted off his small wooden perch and fluttered in one spot, facing the commotion that had just entered the clearing. "Tyler!" Everyone was relieved to see Tyler re-enter their home. Blood matted his black coat, but any evidence of wounds had healed over quickly. He appeared out of breath, but he stood tall as he stumbled toward them. Boris flew to him, and Jack and Bill ran toward him, as did Karen. She caught up to them all quickly as they excitedly welcomed Tyler back, excited he was safe. Tyler put his powerful hands upon Jack's shoulder and looked beyond him to where Karen and Bill stood, looking behind Tyler with a look of shock and fear on their faces. He looked at Jack and noticed that he, too, was in shock and had rendered still and silent, focused intently on what was behind Tyler. Emerging from the small trees behind Tyler was a monstrosity of great magnitude, slowly approaching and finding itself soon beside him. Sasquatch stood full and strong. Its claws nearly reached the ground as his barrel-like arms swung softly in a natural state. Its jaws were powerful and fierce, unlike anything any of them had ever seen. Its coat was chestnut brown and very short, revealing leather patches of skin beneath it. Its bright red eyes burned intensely as it glared at them. Bill just stood there in shock, looking up, his head cocked back fully upon his crooked neck that was fully stretched. His ears were glued to the back of his head, his yellow eyes wide in shock. He pooped. His tail tucked between his legs in a mix of embarrassment, submission, and fear. He couldn't believe he had shit, but he knew he was at the preface of something more powerful than himself. "Don't fear her," Boris said to everyone. "What is it?" Karen asked. "I've never seen anything like that before." She no longer recognized what she once found familiar. She trembled in fear and excitement simultaneously. "Neither have I," Boris answered. "You said her. How do you know it's female?" Karen asked. "I can smell it in her blood." Karen felt strangely connected to this towering beast that must have been at least 10 feet tall. She stepped forward. Jack, staying by her side, stepped forward as well. Bill was synchronized to their movements, and they all stepped up to the beast. Tyler turned around to face it. "Is it her?" Karen asked, greatly bewildered. Tyler stepped closer to her than the others had. He reached out to her, and his big black clawed hands looked small compared to the new monster's hands that was standing there hulking but calm. His hand became engulfed in hers. His tail wagged, and his tongue flopped from his mouth. The others could see he was excited, and none of them were shocked when the monster of monsters also wagged her tail that hadn't been there earlier that night. "I think Tyler did this," Karen offered. "He bit her." There were no signs of injury or wounds of any kind, no lacerations. Her eye had healed. "I think so," Boris responded. Karen continued looking at the monster, the Sasquatch beast. "What do we call her?" Boris pondered. Then, "How about Squatchanthrope?" Karen looked at the fruit bat as he fluttered dizzily to get a better look at the new monster. He was close to its face. "No, I mean, what name do we call her?" Boris didn't hear her. He had become enthralled with the new creation, the new species. In all the hundreds of years of his existence, he had never seen or dreamed of anything like this. "I wonder if she'd like the name Tracy," Karen said. The Squatchanthrope wagged her tail at the suggestion. "Tracy it is," confirmed Karen. She studied Tyler's interaction with Tracy, and she could tell he was in love instantly with her. Tracy seemed to be in the same state of mind toward him. I don't understand how his bite changed her so fast. Some things may never be learned, Boris suggested. For now, we'll just have to theorize that it has something to do with the species and their process internally. Karen nodded in agreement. Well, however it happened, she looked from Boris to Tracy. Welcome to the pack. Boris flew up, higher into the darkness, far above the tops of the flames that licked upward, reaching out toward the stars. He ended up disappearing into his pine tree. He emerged a moment later with the blue tarantula in his mouth. He swooped downward and found his way to Tracy. He dropped the spider and it landed soundly on Tracy's broad shoulder. There's Green. I've kept him safe. Green? But he's blue, Karen corrected lightly. Blue? It's hard to see specific colors. I'm sonar, remember? Besides, he tasted more like green to me. Boris chuckled as he flew higher and higher. He shouted out as he disappeared into the waiting forest. I'm going out for dinner. Don't wait up. Karen smiled at the growing pack and the blue tarantula named Green. She stood there before Tracy and placed her paw out. Tracy took it. I remember, Karen whispered. Tracy nodded her head yes, to indicate that she did too, then did her best to offer a silly-looking smile that was lopsided and full of large, sharp, jagged teeth that were surprisingly white. Tyler, Bill, and Jack all howled to show their acceptance of the growth of their family. They also charged toward Tracy and crowded behind her in an eager attempt to smell her butt. Elizabeth stood near the kitchen sink, scrubbing the stainless steel until it gleamed her reflection back at her. She knew when she looked better in a reflection of steel than she did herself that the steel was clean. She rinsed the already clean sponge and placed it on the inside of the sink closet, out of sight. She couldn't stand it when people left sponges on the back of the sink or wash rags hanging from the faucet, and she smiled at her reflection. The squeak from the chains on the newly installed swing set took hold of her attention. She turned from the sink and walked past the island and to the back door. She slid the large glass door to the side. Come on in now, Dylan. It's time to get ready for bed. Dylan continued to swing back and forth, his feet far from the ground as his small frame held to the metal change, kicking and bending to keep the rhythm of the swing. Elizabeth looked like a black shadow silhouetted in the warm golden glow of the house lights behind her. Can I have just 5 more minutes? Fine. Elizabeth, slightly annoyed at Dylan's persistence, turned and looked behind her. The island and the stove needed one final wipe, so the entire kitchen would be as shiny as the sink and refrigerator she had already scrubbed to perfection. She turned back to him. But as soon as I finish the kitchen, you're coming in. No pouting. Understand? Okay, Mommy, Dylan agreed. Karen lay snug and warm in Jack's powerful arms. She felt safe, and nothing was a threat to her when she wrapped himself around her. His body heat was hot, and Karen let it sink into her skin. Bill stood tall and tilted his head at Karen. Karen noticed the communication. Bring back a rabbit or two if you can, she suggested. We're a little hungry, too. Bill wagged his tail once to let her know he would bring back something to eat for everyone. He ran off into the woods. She watched Tracy and Tyler. Tracy slept on her side with Tyler beside her, her huge arms draped around him, virtually hiding him from sight. Her enormous frame beside Tyler's small frame in comparison swallowed him up. Karen knew the comfort and warmth Tyler must be feeling at that moment. They both slept soundly as their legs twitched as if running in unison. Karen wondered if they shared the same dream. Heat continued to pour from Jack like an open oven door, heated to broil. She absorbed it and basked in it. A soft breeze, cool in contrast to Jack's body heat, rubbed gently against Karen's human skin. The sensitivity of the sense of touch had multiplied as a human, which she hadn't expected. All the other senses were much higher in werewolf form. Food tasted better, and smells and sounds were stronger and sharper. She could hear a rat scatter beneath dried leaves from 100 feet away. But now, as a human, the surface of her body was an intensified experience of everything that came in contact with her. The soft, cool breeze caressed her face and bare legs. Karen pressed into Jack. She could feel her nipples react to the stimulation the breeze offered her in combination with the hot breath and, now, intoxicating body heat that was touching every inch of Karen's body. She pressed into him even more than before. She could feel that her arousal was contagious, and the sensation of Jack's hardening phallus against her lower back convinced her that he had caught her fever. She slowly emerged from Jack's embrace and stood. She wore only a large white button-down shirt that belonged to Jack when he was human. She reached out to him, and he accepted. Jack stood tall. Karen looked down. The flames of the bonfire plagued Jack's physique with dancing shadows. His penis was hard and ready for Karen. It was large enough that Karen worried about the effects it would have on her body. If he tore me, would I heal like I did as a werewolf? She wondered. It was a chance she was going to have to take. She wanted him, and she wasn't going to be passive about it. Still holding hands, the two slowly disappeared into the woods and headed to the opposite side that Bill had gone, leaving Tracy and Tyler alone in their twitchy slumber. The bedroom light went dark at the flick of a switch, but the soft blue lamp beside Dylan's bed painted him blue. Dancing stars fluttered about the walls as the lamp spun slowly, light escaping from its porcelain sides through the small star-shaped holes. "Good night," Elizabeth told Dylan as she smiled and closed his bedroom door. "Don't let the bedbugs bite." "Leave it open, please," Dylan said quietly from under his blankets that he had pulled up far enough that only his eyes were seen peering out from under them. Elizabeth smiled and left the door open a few inches. Dylan watched as his mother disappeared from sight. "Mommy?" Silence. The air was still. Even the soft humming of the lamp that spun stars was now eerily quiet. The light in the hall went out, and the light that had shined through his slightly open door was now replaced by the menacing pitch black that seemed to creep further into his bedroom. Dylan climbed out of his bed, took a small blanket from the foot of his bed, and closed the door completely, regretting having requested it remain open. He placed the blanket on the floor to conceal the thin opening under the door and turned his bedroom ceiling light back on. His room was bright and cheerful, and all the shadows that hid the monsters in his room were gone, for now. Boris flew high. He had managed to find a few mosquitoes and other small insects, but wasn't content. There had not been enough substance in his diet tonight. Through the indistinct shape of the trees that buzzed beneath him, he caught sight of something that imprisoned his attention. He could not dismiss it, whatever it was. It was a smell of death and a flash of red, perhaps a dead fox if he was lucky. He fluttered dizzily down, his messy dance of descent. As he got closer to the source, he knew the smell of death was too strong to be that of a freshly dead fox or any other animal. This was a smell of rot and decay that only came to things long after bloating, the expulsion of natural gases, and the liquefying of the softer organs and tissue. This was long dead, whatever it was. As Boris got even closer and the flash of red appeared sharper and more defined, it was finally apparent what was drawing him closer. It was Ginger. "Quick, get the others," Boris thought. He flew in his clumsy manner, and in his haste and panic, he slammed headfirst into a thick and towering maple tree. He spiraled downward and landed on the ground. Against his wishes, the tree had convinced him that it was time to take a short nap. He lay on the ground, unconscious. The moonlight bathed them. Their bodies seemed to light up in its glow. Jack stood tall as ever, and Karen stood before him, her fingers caressing the small white buttons of her shirt that she wore. Each button was made to find its way free of the loop that held them. Her hands gracefully slid to the next button and repeated the process. Jack drooled. The last button slid out of its loop, and Karen slowly opened her shirt. Her body was smooth, her breasts were supple, and the moonlight played delicately upon them, her nipples hardening at the act of teasing Jack. She walked slowly, seductively toward him, where he waited eagerly. He could smell her. Her scent was delicious. Karen's womanly aroma and ever-present pheromones seduced him into a sexual frenzy of longing and anticipation. Her hands found his chest. His heart slammed against her palms. Her left hand traveled up, exploring his neck, his snout. She placed her finger in his mouth, tracing each sharp tooth gently. She could feel his tongue get more wet as her flavor enticed his appetite for her. Jack pulled her close. He lifted his hand to her face and traced her jawline. His black nail found her parted lips and traced those as well. Her left hand took his and felt his finger against her mouth as her moist lips parted, and she guided it into it. Again, she reached up to his mouth and wiped away some of the drool that had gathered on his bottom jaw. Her fingers were wet with his saliva. She slipped the open shirt off, and it fell to her feet. She turned from him and slowly walked away. She stopped at a low-hanging tree branch. "Take me," she whispered. When they were finished, she backed into him, and his thick, hairy arms found themselves around her, holding her. They explored her body, her breasts, the heat between her thighs, and feeling her begin to squirm against him again was intoxicating. Karen turned to face Jack. "Come down here." He did as she requested. "Open your mouth." She smiled. He did as she requested. She slowly placed the base of her neck and her shoulder in his mouth, snug between his canines. "Bite me." He did, as she requested. Blood poured down her bare back.